My name is Amara, and at 32 years old, I never imagined my life would be reduced to a single muddy suitcase on the side of a road. When my parents passed away within weeks of each other, my sister Candace inherited their $30 million estate and the family mansion in Buckhead. I thought we would grieve together. I thought we were family. But on the night of the funeral, she threw my clothes into the driveway and told me to find somewhere else to die because I was useless now. Days later at the lawyer office, she would turn pale as a sheet. She had been so busy celebrating her new wealth that she never bothered to read page 42 of the will. Before I tell you how a single clause in a legal document destroyed her entire world, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to rebuild your life after the people you trusted most betrayed you. The rain in Atlanta that evening was relentless. It hammered against the stained glass windows of the heavy oak doors, a rhythm that matched the throbbing pain in my joints. Inside the mansion, the air smelled of expensive lilies and catered roast beef. This was the repast, the gathering after the funeral, but it felt more like a networking event for my sister Candace and her husband Preston. I stood in the shadows of the kitchen doorway, pressing my back against the cool wall. My black dress was old, the fabric thinning at the elbows, a stark contrast to the sea of designer silk and Italian wool filling the living room. My parents had only been in the ground for 6 hours, but the house already felt different. It felt cold. Candace stood in the center of the room, holding a crystal flute of champagne. She looked radiant, which was a terrible thing to be at a funeral. Her hair was laid to perfection, her makeup flawless, and she wore a black dress that likely cost more than my medical bills for the entire year. She was laughing at something a local councilman was saying, her hand resting possessively on Preston's arm. Preston, my brother-in-law, scanned the room with the hungry eyes of a shark. He was a real estate developer who had been trying to get my father to sell this house for a decade. Now that Dad was gone, Preston looked at the crown moldings and the marble floors, not with memories, but with dollar signs in his eyes. I tried to make myself smaller. My lupus was flaring up, triggered by the stress and grief of the last few weeks. My knees felt like they were filled with broken glass, and my hands trembled slightly. I just wanted a glass of water, but I was afraid to step into the crowd. I felt like an intruder in the home where I had grown up. "Excuse me," a voice boomed to my left. I flinched. A heavy-set man with a red face and an expensive watch was thrusting an empty glass toward me. "You are taking too long with the refills. I need another bourbon, neat. And make sure it is the good stuff from the cabinet in the study, not the cheap swill on the bar." I stared at him, blinking back tears. He thought I was the help. He thought I was a waitress hired for the event. I opened my mouth to correct him, to tell him that my name was Amara, and that the man we buried today was my father. But the words stuck in my throat. "Oh, just get him the drink, Amara." The voice cut through the noise like a knife. I looked up to see Candace gliding over. She didn't look angry at the man for insulting her sister. She looked annoyed at me. "She is a little slow, sir, please forgive her," Candace said with a tight, apologetic smile directed at the guest. She turned her cold eyes to me. "You heard him, Amara. Go get the bourbon. You are used to serving people anyway, aren't you? Since you spent the last 5 years living here for free, making yourself useful is the least you can do." The humiliation burned hotter than the inflammation in my joints. My own sister was reducing me to a servant at our parents' repast. I looked at Preston, hoping for some defense, but he just smirked and checked his phone. I took the glass. My hands shook as I walked to the study. I did it because I didn't want to cause a scene. I did it because I was too exhausted to fight. I did it because part of me believed her. I had lived here while caring for Mom and Dad. Maybe I really was just a burden. The hours dragged on. Slowly the guests began to filter out, taking their condolences and their gossip with them. The catering staff began clearing the tables, their movements efficient and silent. I sat on a small stool in the kitchen, waiting. I needed to talk to Candace about the timeline. I needed to know if we could keep the medical equipment in the guest room for a few weeks until I figured out where to donate it. Finally, the front door clicked shut for the last time. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I walked into the living room. Candace was kicking off her heels, collapsing onto the velvet sofa. Preston was pouring himself a generous drink from my father's private collection. "Candace," I said softly, "we need to talk about Mom's things. And I need to pick up my prescription tomorrow, but the pharmacy card was in Dad's wallet." Preston turned around. He didn't look tired anymore. He looked energized. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "We don't need to talk about anything," Amara Preston said, taking a sip of the amber liquid. "The only thing we need to discuss is your departure." I frowned, confused. Departure. "I am not going anywhere tonight, Preston. It is pouring rain. I am just going to go to my room and rest. My joints are killing me." "That is not your room anymore," Candace said. She didn't even look at me. She was examining her manicure. "In fact, this isn't your house anymore. It is mine, ours. And frankly, Amara, we are tired. We are tired of the smell of sickness. We are tired of seeing you mope around in those rags. We want a fresh start. And a fresh start doesn't include a 32-year-old woman with no job and a mountain of medical debt living in our guest suite." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Candace, I have lived here for 5 years. I took care of them. I was the one who changed the diapers. I was the one who managed the hospice nurses. You can't just kick me out. I didn't ask you to do any of that," she snapped, finally looking at me. Her eyes were hard, devoid of any sisterly affection. "You did that because you had nowhere else to go. You used their illness as an excuse to leech off them. But the free ride is over." Preston set his glass down on a coaster. He walked over to the hallway closet. He opened it and pulled out a single object. It was my suitcase. The battered gray one I had used since college. It was packed. It was bulging at the seams. "I packed it for you during the service," Preston said with a cruel smile. "I didn't want you to strain yourself carrying heavy loads with your condition. I put your clothes and your toiletries in there. Everything else in the room, the furniture, the books, the electronics stays. It is part of the estate." "You went through my things," I whispered, horror rising in my throat. "I went through my house," Preston corrected. "And you are leaving. Now." "Please," I begged, looking from him to Candace. "I have a flare-up. I can barely walk. I have no money on me. Just let me stay the night. Just one night. I will leave in the morning." Candace stood up. She walked over to me, towering over my shrinking frame. "You are pathetic, Amara. Look at you. You are a sinkhole. You sucked the life out of Mom and Dad, and now you want to suck the life out of us. This house is worth $5 million. I am not going to let it smell like a hospital ward just because you are too lazy to get a job. Find somewhere else to be sick." She grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. I cried out in pain as she yanked me toward the front door. Preston followed, dragging the suitcase. He opened the heavy double doors, and the sound of the storm rushed in. The wind howled, blowing rain into the foyer, wetting the expensive rug. "Get out!" Candace screamed over the thunder. "And don't come back begging. If I see you on this property again, I will call the police for trespassing." Preston threw the suitcase. It tumbled down the stone steps, landing in a puddle of mud. The clasp broke, and my clothes spilled out, soaking instantly in the dirty water. Candace shoved me. I stumbled, my weak knees buckling. I fell hard onto the wet concrete of the porch. Pain shot through my hips and wrists. I looked back up at them. My sister, my own flesh and blood, stood framed by the warm golden light of the hallway. She looked like a demon. "Make something of yourself, Amara." Preston laughed. "Or don't. We don't care." They slammed the heavy wooden doors. I heard the distinct sound of the deadbolt sliding into place. Then the click of the security lock. I was alone. I dragged myself down the steps, crying not from the physical pain, but from the sheer cruelty of it. I crawled into the mud, gathering my soaking wet sweaters, my only pair of good jeans, my underwear. The rain mixed with my tears. I looked up at the house at the window of the room that used to be mine. The light went out. They thought I was finished. They thought I was trash to be discarded. As I shivered in the cold Atlanta rain, clutching my muddy belongings, a spark of something hot ignited in my chest. It wasn't grief. It was rage. They had taken my home. They had taken my dignity. But they had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated the sister they called useless. I wiped the mud from my face and forced myself to stand up. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of their nightmare. The motel room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner, a combination that made my stomach churn. Outside the thin window, a neon sign buzzed with an erratic rhythm, flashing pink light across the stained carpet every 3 seconds. I lay curled in a fetal position on the lumpy mattress, clutching my knees to my chest. The adrenaline from the confrontation at the mansion had worn off, leaving behind the cold, sharp reality of my condition. My lupus was flaring with a vengeance. It felt as if someone had replaced my synovial fluid with crushed glass. Every movement was a negotiation with pain. I reached for my purse on the nightstand, my fingers trembling uncontrollably. I shook the orange prescription bottle. It was empty. The rattle of plastic against plastic was the loneliest sound in the world. I poured the contents of my wallet onto the bedspread. 3 crumpled dollar bills, a handful of quarters, and a few dimes. This was my net worth. I was 32 years old. I had a degree in art history. I had hands that could restore a 17th century veneer to perfection, and I had exactly $4.80 to my name. I closed my eyes, trying to escape the throbbing in my joints. The rhythmic flashing of the neon light faded, and I drifted into a feverish half-sleep. Suddenly, the smell of stale smoke was replaced by the scent of old paper beeswax and pipe tobacco. I was back in my father's study. It was 6 months ago, just before the cancer took his strength completely. The room was warm, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that held generations of history. Dad was sitting in his leather armchair, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He waved me over, his hand shaking, as he reached into the drawer of his mahogany desk. "Amara," he whispered, his voice raspy, "I need you to listen to me." I sat on the ottoman at his feet, resting my head on his knee. "I am listening, Daddy." He pulled out a small, weather-beaten notebook bound in brown leather. It looked insignificant, something you might find at a yard sale for 50 cents. But he held it like it was made of gold. "Your mother and I, we made mistakes," he said, his eyes watering. "We let Candace believe that success is measured by the brand on your purse. We failed her by giving her everything she asked for. But you, Amara, you learned to see what matters." He pressed the notebook into my hand. "Don't let your sister see this," he warned, his grip surprisingly tight. "Candace sees the price tag. You see the value. There is a difference, baby girl. A dangerous difference. If anything happens to me, promise me you will keep this safe. It is the key to everything." In the dream, I opened the notebook. The pages were filled with my father's sprawling handwriting, lists of dates, names, and serial numbers. I didn't understand it then. I just nodded, promising him I would protect it. I promised him I would protect the history of our family. I woke up with a gasp, sweat drenching my forehead. The motel room was freezing. The memory of the notebook hit me with the force of a physical blow. In the chaos of the funeral, in the rush of grief, and then the violence of being kicked out, I had left it. I had left the brown leather notebook in the hidden compartment of the desk in the study. Panic surged through me, overriding the pain in my hips. I grabbed my phone, the screen brightness stinging my eyes. I needed to see what was happening at the house. I needed to know if they had touched the study. I opened Instagram, and there it was, a live notification from Candace. I tapped the screen. My heart stopped. Candace was standing in the middle of the living room, wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of green juice. Behind her, 2 men in coveralls were hauling furniture out the front door. My father's favorite armchair, the antique sideboard from the hallway. "Hey guys!" Candace chirped at the camera, flashing a bright artificial smile. So Preston and I are doing a huge cleanse today. You know how old energy can just linger in a house, especially after sad events. We are getting rid of all this dusty old junk. Out with the old, in with the new. We are manifesting abundance and modern vibes only. The camera panned to the side. Preston was standing by the fireplace. He was holding a porcelain vase, a piece I knew was from the Harlem Renaissance era, worth at least $5,000. Trash, Preston said, and he tossed it into a large plastic bin filled with broken debris. The sound of the shattering porcelain tore through me. No, I screamed at my phone, my voice cracking. No, please. Candace laughed, reading the comments on her stream. Yes, girl, purge it all. Exactly. We are replacing everything with custom Italian minimalism. It is going to be so chic. Watch this space for the reveal. She was destroying it. She wasn't just renovating. She was erasing our parents. She was erasing the history Dad had spent 40 years collecting. And somewhere in that house, or worse in one of those dumpsters, was the brown notebook. I couldn't just lie there. I had to survive. I needed money, and I needed it now. If I was going to save anything, I needed resources. I forced myself to sit up, swallowing the bile in my throat. I scrolled through my contacts looking for Mr. Henderson. He was an antique dealer downtown who had always admired my restoration work. He had told me once that if I ever needed a job, his door was open. I dialed the number. It rang 3 times. Hello, Henderson Antiques. Mr. Henderson, it is Amara. Amara Washington. There was a pause. A long, uncomfortable silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Amara? Mr. Henderson's voice was cold, stripped of its usual warmth. I am surprised you are calling. I hesitated. Mr. Henderson, I know it is sudden, but I am looking for work, even just freelance. I can come in and finish that restoration on the Victorian vanity you have in the back. I really need the hours. Amara, look, he cut me off. I had a conversation with your brother-in-law this morning, Preston, I whispered. Why were you talking to Preston? He called to warn the local dealers, Mr. Henderson said, his voice lowering. He told us about the missing silver from the estate. He said you were struggling with substance issues, and that items went missing before you were asked to leave the house. The room spun. Substance issues. Missing silver. Preston wasn't just kicking me out, he was salting the earth. He was making sure I had nowhere to go, no way to earn a living, no credibility in the only industry I knew. Mr. Henderson. That is a lie, I pleaded, tears streaming down my face. You know me. You know my father. I have never stolen a thing in my life. I have lupus, not a drug problem. I am sorry, Amara, he said, and he sounded genuinely regretful. But business is business. I can't take the risk. Preston implied he would file charges if we aided and abetted. I wish you luck. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, the silence of the motel room deafening. They had taken my home. They were destroying my heritage. And now they had stolen my name. I looked at the $4 on the bedspread. I looked at my swollen hands. A dark, cold clarity washed over me, numbing the physical pain. Crying wasn't going to save the notebook. Begging wasn't going to clear my name. Preston and Candace thought they had buried me. They thought that by stripping me of my money and my reputation, I would just fade away into the gutter. But they forgot one thing. They forgot that I was the one who restored broken things for a living. I knew how to take something that looked shattered and worthless and find the strength hidden underneath the cracks. I stood up and walked to the bathroom sink. I splashed cold water on my face, watching the dirt and tears swirl down the drain. I wasn't going to sleep. I put on my coat. I had to get back to the house. I had to get to the dumpsters before the garbage trucks came. If the notebook was there, it was the only weapon I had left. And I was going to find it even if I had to tear through every bag of trash with my bare, bleeding hands. The text message from Mrs. Gable came at 11:30 at night. It was brief and urgent, just 3 words that made my blood run cold. They are dumping it. Mrs. Gable lived across the street from my parents' house for 40 years. She was the neighborhood watch commander, the keeper of secrets, and the woman who used to sneak me ginger cookies when my mother put me on diets I did not need. I knew exactly what she meant. I threw my coat over my pajamas, ignoring the stiffness in my knees and the ache in my lower back. My lupus was flaring again, triggered by the stress of the motel and the lack of proper food, but pain was a luxury I could not afford right now. I drove my beat-up sedan through the rain-slicked streets of Buckhead, praying I was not too late. When I turned the corner onto the street that used to be my home, my headlights swept across a scene that broke my heart. A massive industrial dumpster sat on the front lawn looking like a festering metal wound on the perfect green grass. It was overflowing. I parked 3 houses down, killing the engine and the lights. I did not want to wake the neighbors, and more importantly, I did not want to alert the occupants of the house. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a heavy, humid mist that clung to my skin. I crept toward the dumpster, the smell of wet cardboard and old wood hitting me before I even reached the rim. This was not garbage. This was my life. I peered over the edge and gasped. It was a massacre of memories. My father's library was in there. Hundreds of books, first editions of African American literature he had collected since the 70s, were tossed in a heap, their spines broken, their pages swelling with moisture. I saw the easel my mother used to paint on before her arthritis got too bad. I saw the hand-carved rocking chair Dad had built for Candace when she was pregnant, the one she said was too rustic for her modern nursery. They were throwing it all away. To Candace and Preston, these were just old things taking up space. To me, they were the physical evidence that we had existed, that we had loved, that we were a family. I had to get inside. The metal side of the dumpster was slippery and high. I gritted my teeth, grabbed the rim, and pulled myself up. A sharp pain shot through my shoulder, tearing a cry from my throat, but I swallowed it down. I swung my legs over and dropped onto a pile of curtains. The instability of the trash shifted beneath my feet. I lost my balance and fell onto my hands and knees, my palms scraping against something rough. I felt around in the dark. It was a wooden frame. I pulled it up. It was a portrait of my grandparents. The glass shattered. I started digging. I was frantic. I moved piles of clothes, recognizing my mother's Sunday hats and my father's work shirts. I was looking for one thing: the brown leather notebook. Dad said it was the key. He said Candace only saw price tags, but I saw value. I needed to find it before the garbage trucks came in the morning. I tossed aside a broken lamp and a bag of kitchen utensils. My breathing was ragged, loud in the silence of the night. My hands were covered in grime, my fingernails broken. I felt like a scavenger. I felt like the rat Candace accused me of being. Suddenly the world turned white. A blinding light flooded the driveway, pinning me in its glare like an insect on a slide. I shielded my eyes, my heart hammering against my ribs. The floodlights from the second-floor balcony had been turned on. Well, look what the cat dragged in. Or should I say, look what the rat dragged out. I looked up, squinting against the brightness. Candace was standing on the master bedroom balcony. She was wearing a silk kimono and holding a glass of wine. She did not look angry. She looked entertained. In her other hand, she held her phone, the flash on recording me. "Preston, come look at this," she called out, her voice dripping with amusement. "You were right. She is literally garbage diving." Preston stepped out onto the balcony. He was wearing a dark robe, his hands in his pockets. He looked down at me with cold, calculating eyes. He did not laugh. He just watched, his gaze sweeping over the mess I had made in the dumpster. I stood up, my legs shaking. "Candace, please. You can't throw this stuff away. These are Dad's books. This is history. It is trash." Amara Candace laughed. "And so are you. Look at you. Crawling around in the filth where you belong. Smile for the camera, sis. My followers are going to love this." The fallen sister reduced to picking through my leftovers. She zoomed in. I could feel the lens capturing my dirty face, my desperate eyes, my shame. I wanted to curl into a ball and disappear. I wanted to scream. But then I looked at Preston. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at where my hands were digging. He was looking for something too. He knew there were things of value hidden in this house, things he hadn't found yet. If he knew I was looking for the notebook, he would come down here and take it. I had to act fast. I had to ignore the humiliation. Let them film, let them mock. I had a mission. I turned my back to the balcony and kept digging, forcing myself to tune out Candace's cruel commentary. "Oh my God, she is still going!" Candace shrieked with laughter. "Have some dignity, Amara. Go buy your own junk." My hand brushed against something hard and rectangular buried under a pile of old National Geographic magazines. It was a wooden box, a cigar box. My heart skipped a beat. Dad didn't smoke cigars, but he used old boxes to store things. I recognized the smell of cedar. I pulled it out, shielding it with my body, so Preston couldn't see exactly what it was. I cracked the lid open just an inch. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was the brown leather notebook. And next to it, something I hadn't expected. A heavy iron key ring with 3 old-fashioned keys. They didn't look like house keys. They looked industrial. I slammed the box shut and shoved it deep inside my coat, clutching it against my chest. I had it. I turned back to the balcony. Candace was still filming, narrating my misery to her invisible audience. Preston was leaning over the railing now, his eyes narrowed. "What did you find, Amara?" He called out, his voice sharp. "What did you just put in your jacket?" "Nothing," I yelled back, my voice stronger than I felt. "Just some trash you missed." "Drop it," Preston commanded. He turned to leave the balcony, presumably to come down and confront me. Panic surged through me. I couldn't let him get this box. I scrambled up the side of the dumpster. My boots slipped on a wet plastic bag, and I slammed my chin against the metal rim, tasting blood. I ignored it. I hauled myself over the edge and dropped to the grass, rolling to absorb the impact. "Amara, stop!" Preston's voice boomed from inside the house now. I could hear him running down the stairs. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I ran like I was 16 again, running from the neighborhood dogs. I ran past the manicured hedges, past the mocking white pillars of the porch, past the life that was stolen from me. I reached my car, threw the door open, and threw myself into the driver's seat. As I fumbled with the ignition, the front door of the mansion flew open. Preston burst out barefoot, his face twisted in anger. "Don't you drive away," he shouted, sprinting toward me. "That is my property." The engine sputtered once, then roared to life. I slammed the car into drive and stomped on the gas. The tires screeched on the wet asphalt. I saw Preston in the rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road, watching me disappear into the darkness. I drove for 10 miles before I dared to pull over. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would crack my ribs. I turned on the dome light and pulled the cigar box out of my coat. I opened it again, my hands trembling. The notebook was there. I opened the cover. Inside, in my father's handwriting, was a list of addresses and codes, and taped to the first page was a note. "To Amara, the only one who knows that the true treasure isn't what you see, but what you save. Use the keys." I gripped the cold iron keys in my hand. I didn't know what they opened yet. But as I sat there in my beat-up car smelling of garbage and rain, I knew one thing for sure. Candace had the house. Preston had the bank accounts. But I had the map. And for the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a hunter. The address in my father's notebook led me to an industrial wasteland on the outskirts of Atlanta. It was a district of rusted corrugated iron fences, overgrown weeds, and silence broken only by the distant hum of the highway. I parked my car behind a dumpster, checking the rearview mirror for the 10th time. Paranoia had become my constant companion. I pulled my coat tighter against the morning chill and approached the building marked with the number 427. It looked like an abandoned mechanic shop. The windows were boarded up with plywood, and graffiti covered the brick walls in vibrant, chaotic layers. If Candace had seen this place, she would have sneered and driven away without a second glance. To her, this was just blight. But as I stood before the heavy steel door clutching the iron keyring I had salvaged from the trash, I felt a strange vibration in my chest. This wasn't just a building, it was a secret. I tried the largest key first. It slid into the lock with a satisfying, well-oiled click. Dad had maintained the mechanism perfectly, even if he let the exterior rot. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, bracing myself for the smell of mildew and rats. Instead, I was hit with a wave of cool, dry air that smelled of cedar and lavender. I fumbled for the light switch on the wall. A low hum filled the space as rows of industrial LED lights flickered to life, illuminating a sight that stole the breath from my lungs. It wasn't a garage, it was a museum. The space was cavernous, stretching back at least 200 feet. The walls were lined with climate control units humming softly to keep the humidity at a perfect 45%. And everywhere I looked, there was history. Rows of paintings leaned against padded racks, covered in protective muslin sheets. I walked over to the nearest one and carefully lifted the corner of the fabric. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was an original oil painting of a jazz scene in Harlem, the brushstrokes vibrant and alive. I recognized the signature instantly. It was a piece by Archibald Motley, a master of the Harlem Renaissance. A painting like this wasn't just valuable, it was priceless. And there were dozens of them. I moved deeper into the room, my footsteps echoing on the polished concrete floor. In the center of the warehouse, furniture was arranged as if waiting for a grand salon. There were mahogany sideboards with intricate inlay work that I knew just by the grain were crafted by Thomas Day, the legendary free black cabinet maker from the 1800s. I stopped in front of a chair in the corner. It looked unassuming to the untrained eye, just an old chair with faded velvet upholstery. But I was an antique restorationist. I knew what I was looking at. I knelt down, examining the legs. The carving was exquisite, a signature floral motif that belonged to the Louis XIV era, but modified with African design elements that suggested it had a unique, perhaps royal provenance. I ran my hand along the wood. It was solid walnut, not veneer. This chair alone in its current condition would fetch $50,000 at auction. Restored, it could go for double. My father hadn't just been collecting junk. He had been preserving a legacy. He had been saving pieces of Black history that the world had tried to forget or destroy. He had built an ark right here in this forgotten warehouse while Candace was busy buying designer handbags and Preston was gambling away their savings on bad crypto investments. "Why did you hide this, Daddy?" I whispered into the silence. Then I realized he hid it to protect it. He knew that if Candace saw this, she would have sold it all for pennies to the first dealer who offered her quick cash. She would have stripped the history for the sake of a down payment on a beach house. He needed someone who understood the soul of these objects. He needed me. I spent the next 3 hours cataloging. I opened the notebook and began matching the items to his list. Every entry had a story. Every acquisition date told me where he had been when he told Mom he was just going fishing. He had been rescuing our heritage. But my awe was cut short by the vibration of my phone in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text from Mrs. Gable, my neighbor. "Honey, there is a strange car parked down the street from the motel where you are staying. A black sedan, men with cameras. Be careful." I froze. The motel, Preston. I had been so careful leaving this morning, but I had underestimated him. Preston wasn't smart, but he was predatory. He knew I had run away with something from the trash. He didn't know what it was, but his greed made him suspicious. If he found me here, if he found this warehouse, he would claim it as part of the estate. He would bring in his lawyers and his movers, and this sanctuary would be gutted before I could save a single painting. I looked around the room, panic rising in my throat. I couldn't stay here. It wasn't safe. But I couldn't leave these things unprotected either. I needed a plan. I needed to move the most valuable portable items to a secure location, and I needed to do it fast. But more than that, I needed legal standing. Possession was 9/10 of the law, but Preston had the deed to the main house and the executor status. I walked back to the Louis XIV chair. I reached underneath the seat, feeling for the manufacturer's label, a habit of mine. My fingers brushed against something taped to the bottom of the frame. It felt like an envelope. I pulled it loose. It was a thick manila envelope sealed with wax. On the front, in Dad's handwriting, it said, "For Amara. Open only when you understand what you are protecting." I tore it open. Inside was a single document. It wasn't a will. It was a bill of sale. Dated 5 years ago, it transferred ownership of the warehouse and all its contents to a generic LLC named Phoenix Restoration. I frowned. I had never heard of Phoenix Restoration. I flipped the page, and there at the bottom of the incorporation papers was the name of the sole proprietor, Amara Washington. I gasped, dropping the paper. Dad hadn't just left me a notebook. He had legally given me this entire building 5 years ago. He had set up the company in my name, using my social security number, likely forging my signature on the initial documents to keep it a secret, even from me, until the time was right. I was the owner. Candace couldn't touch this, Preston couldn't touch this, but they didn't know that yet. And if they found the papers before I could file them with the probate court, they would destroy them. Preston would burn this envelope and claim it never existed. I heard the sound of a car engine outside. It was slow prowling, tires crunching on gravel. I shoved the papers into my internal coat pocket right next to my heart. I grabbed the notebook. I killed the lights, plunging the warehouse back into darkness. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against the cold steel. The car stopped. A door opened. Footsteps. I held my breath. I was trapped. If they came in, I was done. But then I remembered the back exit. Dad always had a back exit. I moved silently through the dark, navigating by memory of the layout I had just seen. I reached the rear loading dock. There was a small personnel door. I pushed the panic bar. It was rusted stiff. I pushed harder, ignoring the pain in my wrist. It gave way with a groan of protesting metal. I slipped out into the overgrown alleyway just as I heard the front door handle rattle. "Hey, is anyone in there?" a man's voice shouted. It wasn't Preston. It was a stranger. A private investigator. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran into the tall weeds, circling back toward my car, keeping low. I had the deed. I had the proof. Now I just needed to survive long enough to use it. The game had changed. I wasn't just a scavenger anymore. I was the CEO of Phoenix Restoration, and I was about to go to war. The coffee shop Preston chose for our meeting was one of those places where the barista wears a leather apron and the menu doesn't list prices. It was in the heart of Buckhead, surrounded by high-end boutiques and law firms. I sat at a small marble table in the corner, feeling conspicuously out of place. My coat was still damp from the warehouse, my boots were scuffed with mud, and I hadn't washed my hair in 2 days. The air conditioning was set to a temperature that felt arctic to my inflamed joints. Every time the door opened, a draft hit my knees, sending spikes of pain up my legs that made me want to curl into a ball. But I sat upright, clutching my battered purse against my stomach. Inside that purse was the cigar box, the notebook, and the deed to the warehouse. I wasn't letting it out of my sight. I checked my watch. Preston was 10 minutes late. It was a power move, of course. He wanted me to sit here soaking in the smell of roasted beans I couldn't afford, feeling the weight of my poverty. I looked at the menu on the table. A latte was $7. I had less than $5 in my pocket. My stomach growled, a loud, embarrassing sound that made a woman at the next table glance over with pity. I took a sip of the free tap water the server had dropped off, trying to quell the nausea that came from taking my lupus medication on an empty stomach. Finally, the glass door swung open. Preston walked in like he owned the building. He was wearing a navy blue suit that fit him perfectly, a stark contrast to the frayed sleeves of my sweater. He didn't look like a man whose wife had just thrown her sister onto the street. He looked like a man who had just closed $1 million deal. He spotted me and flashed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Amara," he said, his voice smooth and loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "I am so glad you came. You look tired." He sat down without waiting for a response and signaled the waiter. 2 coffees. The single origin pour over for me and for the lady. Get her a large hot chocolate and a croissant. She looks like she needs the sugar. It was patronizing treating me like a child, but I didn't protest. I was starving. Preston, I said, keeping my voice low. Why are we here? You made it very clear last night that I wasn't welcome in your life. Preston sighed, leaning back in his chair. He clasped his hands together, resting them on the table. Look, Amara. Last night was emotional. Funerals are high-stress environments. Candace was upset. She feels terrible about how things went down. She has been crying all morning. I almost laughed. Candace didn't cry unless she broke a nail or lost a follower on Instagram. She doesn't have to cry, Preston. She just has to unlock the door and let me get my medical equipment. Preston shook his head slowly, his expression full of faux sympathy. We can't do that, Amara. We have to think about the environment. The house, it needs to be a place of positivity. And frankly, seeing you sick, seeing all those pill bottles, it is triggering for her grief. We have to prioritize her mental health. The waiter arrived with the drinks and the pastry. The smell of the warm buttered croissant made my mouth water. I picked it up and took a bite, hating myself for how grateful I felt for the food he was buying. Preston watched me eat, a satisfied glint in his eyes. He waited until I had finished half the pastry before he reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a white envelope and slid it across the marble table. We want to help you, Amara. We know you are struggling. We know you don't have a job or a place to stay. Candace and I talked, and we decided to give you a head start. I looked at the envelope. I didn't touch it. What is this? Open it, he urged gently. I wiped the crumbs from my fingers and opened the flap. Inside was a cashier's check. My breath hitched. It was for $10,000. $10,000! My mind started racing. That was enough to rent an apartment for 6 months. It was enough to buy my medications without insurance. It was enough to buy food, new clothes, a warm bed. For a moment, just a fleeting moment, the desperation took over. I could take this money and disappear. I could stop fighting. I could just survive. Preston saw the hesitation in my eyes. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. It is a gift, Amara. No strings attached. We just want you to be safe. We want you to be somewhere comfortable where you can focus on getting better. Or at least managing your pain. He pulled a folded document from his pocket and placed it next to the check. There is just one small formality, my lawyer insisted. It is just a standard release form. It basically says that you accept this gift in lieu of any future claims against the estate. It protects Candace from any legal headaches so she can move on. You know how litigious people can be. I looked at the document. The text was dense, but the bold letters at the top were clear: waiver of inheritance and release of liability. If I signed this, I was signing away my right to contest the will. I was signing away my right to the house, to Dad's collection, to everything. I was selling my birthright for $10,000, but $10,000 was real. It was here on the table. The warehouse and the hidden fortune were just a possibility, a gamble that might take years to pay off. My joints were screaming in agony. My body was begging me to take the easy way out. I picked up the pen Preston had placed on the document. My hand was shaking. That is it, Preston encouraged, his voice soft, hypnotic. Just sign right there at the bottom. Then you can take the check to the bank across the street. You can sleep in a real hotel tonight, Amara. No more sleeping in your car. No more pain. I lowered the pen to the paper. The tip hovered over the signature line. Then I saw it. It was subtle, a movement so slight that if I hadn't been looking down, I would have missed it. Preston's eyes weren't on the paper. They weren't on my face. They were fixed on my purse. The battered leather bag was resting on my lap, the flap slightly askew. He was staring at the bulge where the cigar box was hidden. His gaze was intense, predatory, calculating. He wasn't looking at a bag. He was looking at a target. He knew. He didn't know exactly what I had found in the dumpster, but he knew I had found something. He had seen me hide it in my coat. He had chased me, and now he was trying to buy me off. This wasn't charity. This wasn't a gift. This was a purchase. He was trying to buy my silence and my rights for $10,000 because he suspected the estate was worth far more than the $30 million they already had. A cold wave of clarity washed over me, suppressing the pain. If he was willing to pay $10,000 to get rid of me this quickly, then what I had in this bag was worth millions. I gripped the pen tighter. Then I lifted it away from the paper. I looked up at Preston. His eyes snapped back to mine, wide with feigned innocence. "Is something wrong?" he asked. I put the pen down. I slid the check back across the table. "I can't sign this, Preston." His smile faltered. "Amara, be reasonable. This is a lot of money. It is more than you have ever seen in your life. Don't be stupid." "I am not being stupid," I said, my voice steady for the first time in days. "I am being careful. Dad always told me to read the fine print. I think I will wait until the official reading of the will before I sign anything, and I will wait for the probate court to release the full inventory of assets." Preston's face hardened. The mask of the benevolent brother-in-law vanished, revealing the cruel, greedy man underneath. He snatched the check off the table. "You are making a mistake, Amara. A very big, very expensive mistake." I stood up, pulling my purse tight against my side. "I don't think I am. I think you are afraid, Preston. I think you are afraid of what I might find if I start asking questions." He stood up too, towering over me. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. "You want to play hardball? Fine. Let's see how hard you can play when you can't walk." He pulled out his phone. "You are still on your parents' health insurance plan, right? The one that covers your lupus medication, the infusions that cost $4,000 a month?" My heart stopped. He knew that was my lifeline. Without that insurance, I would be crippled within weeks. "I am the executor now," Preston hissed. "I control the policy. If you walk out that door without signing this paper, I am canceling your coverage effective immediately. I will call the broker right now." He held his thumb over the call button, his eyes challenging me. "Sign the paper, Amara, or good luck paying for your next flare-up. You will be dead in a year." The cafe fell silent around us, or maybe it was just the blood rushing in my ears. He was threatening my life. He was holding a gun to my head, and the bullet was my own immune system. I looked at the check, then at his cruel, smiling face. I thought of the warehouse. I thought of the notebook. I thought of Dad. "Do it," I whispered. Preston blinked. "What?" "Cancel it," I said, louder this time. "Cancel the insurance. Keep the $10,000. Keep the house. But you won't keep me quiet. And you definitely won't get my signature." I turned and walked away. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I would collapse, but I forced myself to put one foot in front of the other. I walked out of the air conditioning and into the humid Atlanta heat. I had no money. I had no insurance. I had just declared war on a man who held all the cards. But as I clutched my bag to my chest, I knew I had the one card that mattered. I just had to live long enough to play it. Leaving that cafe without taking Preston's money was the most terrifying thing I had ever done. But walking away with my dignity intact ignited a fire in my belly that outweighed the fear. I sat in my car watching Preston storm out. A few minutes later, his phone pressed to his ear, undoubtedly screaming at his insurance broker to cut me off. He thought he had just signed my death warrant. He did not know he had just signed his own. I drove straight back to the warehouse. I did not turn on the lights this time. I used the flashlight on my phone, moving quickly to the small safe in the back office that my father had shown me how to open when I was 12. Inside was the emergency fund of the collection. Small, high-value items that could be liquidated quickly without drawing the attention of major auction houses. I bypassed the diamond cufflinks and the gold coins. I reached for a small velvet pouch containing a Patek Philippe pocket watch from 1928. It was not just a watch. It was a custom piece engraved with the initials of a famous Harlem Renaissance poet who had been a personal friend of my great-grandfather. I knew exactly who to take it to. Julian was a private collector who operated out of a nondescript brownstone in Midtown. He had respected my father immensely and despised the flashy, ignorant new money crowd that Preston represented. I called him from the car. He told me to come to the back door. When I arrived, Julian did not look at my muddy boots or my unwashed hair. He looked at my eyes, and then he looked at the watch. He put on his jeweler's loupe and examined the engraving in silence for 5 minutes. The silence stretched heavy with the weight of my future. Finally, he set the watch down on the velvet tray. $50,000, he said quietly. And I will hold it for 6 months before I list it in case you want to buy it back. He knew. He did not ask why the daughter of a wealthy estate was selling heirlooms out of her purse. He knew that in our world sometimes assets had to bleed to save the legacy. I walked out of his brownstone 20 minutes later with a cashier's check and a heavy envelope of cash. For the first time in days, I could breathe. I stopped at a pharmacy and paid cash for my medication, ensuring my physical survival for another month. Then I drove to the one place Preston had forbidden anyone in the family to visit for the last year: the law offices of Elijah Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker had been my father's attorney and best friend for 40 years. He was the one who taught me how to play chess. But when Dad got sick, Preston had convinced my mother that Whitaker was senile and incompetent, effectively barring him from the estate planning and replacing him with his own corporate sharks. The receptionist looked up as I entered the wood-paneled waiting room. She gasped. "Amara," she whispered, "we heard about the funeral. We heard—" She trailed off, looking at my disheveled appearance. "Mr. Whitaker is in court, but he will be back any minute. Please sit down." When the heavy oak door finally opened and the silver-haired man in the three-piece suit stepped out, he stopped dead in his tracks. He did not look senile. He looked sharp, dangerous, and currently heartbroken. "Amara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't shake my hand. He pulled me into a hug that smelled of peppermint and old books. I held on to him, and finally I let myself cry. Not the angry tears I had shed in the rain, but tears of relief. I was safe here. "Come in," he said, guiding me into his office and closing the door firmly. He poured me a glass of water and sat opposite me, his hands folded on his desk. "I have been waiting for you, Amara. I knew you would come. I tried to go to the funeral, but Preston had security turn me away at the gate." "He turned you away?" I asked, shocked. "You were Dad's best friend." "Preston is a frightened little man," Whitaker said with a dry chuckle. "And frightened men build walls. He knew that if I spoke to you, I would tell you the truth about the estate." I reached into my bag and pulled out the brown notebook and the deed to the warehouse. I slid them across the desk. "I think I found part of the truth," I said. Whitaker put on his glasses. He flipped through the notebook, nodding slowly. Then he looked at the deed. A slow smile spread across his face. "Your father was a brilliant man. He knew Candace would sell the soul of the family for a new Tesla. He hid the assets in plain sight under a corporate entity she was too lazy to investigate. This deed is valid, Amara. You own that warehouse and everything in it. But they have the will," I said, my anxiety flaring. "Preston has a will from 5 years ago that leaves everything to Candace. He showed it to me." Whitaker leaned back, his eyes twinkling with a glint of steel. "That will is real. But it is not the only document your father signed. There is a codicil, an amendment, and there are specific clauses regarding conduct. But before we get to that, you need to understand who you are fighting. Do you know why Preston is so desperate? Do you know why he tried to buy you off with $10,000 today?" I shook my head. I thought he was just greedy. "He is broke," Amara, Whitaker said flatly. "Preston leveraged his own assets to invest in a cryptocurrency exchange that collapsed 3 months ago. He is underwater. He owes millions to private lenders who are not known for their patience. He needs the liquid assets from your parents' estate to cover his bad debts before his creditors come for his kneecaps. That is why he is gutting the house. That is why he is selling the furniture. He doesn't care about the legacy. He is trying to stay out of prison and the hospital. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just sibling rivalry. It wasn't just Candace being mean. It was a robbery. Preston was looting my parents' grave to pay for his gambling addiction. The anger I felt was cold and hard. He is destroying everything I said. He threw Dad's books in a dumpster. We will stop him, Whitaker promised. But we have to be smart. We cannot just walk in and waive this deed. If he knows you have leverage, he might do something desperate and dangerous. We need to trap him. We need to let him think he has won until the very last moment. He opened his drawer and pulled out a fresh legal pad. Here is what we are going to do. We are going to let him proceed with the probate hearing. We are going to let him stand in front of a judge and swear under oath that he has disclosed all assets and treated the beneficiaries with respect. And then when he has perjured himself on public record, we are going to drop the hammer. Whitaker looked at me, his expression serious. But Amara, this will get ugly. They will attack your character. They will drag your medical history through the mud. Are you ready for that? I thought about the rain. I thought about the mud on my suitcase. I thought of my father's voice telling me to see the value, not the price. I have nothing left to lose, Mr. Whitaker, I said. I am ready to burn his house of cards to the ground. Whitaker uncapped his fountain pen. Good. Then let's get to work. First, we need to secure that warehouse. I have a private security team that owes me a favor. By tonight, that building will be Fort Knox. Second, we need to document everything. Every text, every email, every threat Preston has made. I handed him my phone. I have the voicemail he left me about the insurance, and I have the footage from the security cameras at the house. You have the security footage? Whitaker asked, his eyebrows shooting up. I nodded. I have the master password for the cloud backup. Dad gave it to me so I could check on them when I was at the hospital. I don't think Preston knows how to change it. Whitaker smiled, and for the first time it was a genuine predatory smile. If you have footage of them kicking you out of the abuse, Amara, that is not just evidence. That is the kill shot. There is a clause in the trust called the Good Samaritan provision. If we can prove they acted with malice, they lose everything. We spent the next 4 hours plotting. As the sun set over Atlanta, casting long shadows across the office, I realized I had walked in as a victim, but I was walking out as a plaintiff. I had the money. I had the lawyer. And thanks to Preston's arrogance, I had the ultimate weapon. He thought he was fighting a sick, helpless girl. He had no idea he was stepping into a ring with a woman who had nothing left to fear. The auction of my father's watch had bought me more than just time. It had bought me a revolution. I sat in the darkened security office of Mr. Whitaker's firm, my eyes glued to the bank of monitors on the wall. The blue light from the screens illuminated my clenched fists. It was Saturday night, and my childhood home, the sanctuary my parents had built with 40 years of love and hard work, had been turned into a circus. Candace called it a rebranding party. She wanted to introduce herself to the Buckhead social elite as the new matriarch of the Washington estate. But from where I sat watching through the hidden cameras my father had installed for security, it looked more like a desecration. The house was packed with people who didn't know my parents and didn't care about their legacy. They were friends of Preston, loud men in flashy suits, and women who looked at the architecture with critical, calculating eyes. I watched in horror as a man with a martini glass leaned casually against the hand-painted wallpaper in the foyer. This was wallpaper my mother had imported from France, delicate silk that required humidity control. He was rubbing his shoulder against it, laughing at a joke, spilling drops of liquid that left dark, permanent stains on the fabric. In the living room, someone had cranked up the music, the bass thumping so hard the crystal chandelier was vibrating. A woman in stilettos was dancing on the original parquet floors. I cringed as I imagined the sharp heels gouging into the wood, scarring the intricate patterns that my father had polished on his hands and knees every Sunday. They were treating a museum like a frat house. Candace was floating through the crowd wearing a white dress that was too tight and too short for the occasion. She was holding court near the fireplace, gesturing wildly with a glass of red wine. Through the audio feed, her voice came through, tinny but clear. "We are going to gut this entire room," she announced to a group of sycophants. "It is just so dark and heavy, you know. All this old wood. It feels like a mausoleum. We want open concept. We want light. We are going to paint over this wood paneling with a nice crisp matte white. Paint over the mahogany." I felt bile rise in my throat. That wood was over 100 years old. It was irreplaceable. She was going to erase history with a bucket of $50 paint just to chase a trend she saw on Pinterest. But the real horror show happened an hour later. I saw Preston pull Candace aside near the kitchen entrance. His face was tight, sweaty. He wasn't enjoying the party. He was panicked. I turned up the volume on that specific camera feed. "We are short," Candace Preston hissed, grabbing her arm. "The caterers are demanding cash up front because the credit card was declined. And the contractors for the remodel won't start on Monday without a deposit." Candace looked around nervously to see if anyone was watching. "I thought we had the trust money," she whispered. "It takes time to clear." Preston lied smoothly. I know he was lying because I knew the accounts were frozen until probate closed. He continued, "We need cash tonight, just to float us until the big transfer comes through." Candace looked desperate. She didn't want to be embarrassed in front of her new friends. She didn't want the music to stop or the food to run out. Her eyes darted around the room and landed on the hallway leading to the study. The hallway was lined with a series of portraits. They were somber, dignified paintings of African American leaders from the Reconstruction era. My father prized them above almost everything else. "Those," Candace said, pointing a manicured finger, "they are creepy anyway. Their eyes follow me when I walk to the bathroom. Get rid of them." Preston nodded. "I know a guy. He buys estate contents. He is waiting in the service van out back." My heart hammered against my ribs. No, not the portraits. I watched as Candace marched down the hallway. She didn't use gloves, she didn't check the frames, she just yanked the paintings off the wall one by one. She stacked them on the floor like they were old pizza boxes. These were works of art that belonged in the Smithsonian, and she was treating them like garage sale leftovers. Preston hauled them out the back door to the service entrance. I switched camera views. A shady-looking man in a leather jacket was waiting by a white van. He looked at the paintings and shrugged. $500 for the lot," the man said. "The frames are chipped. 500. My father had paid 10,000 for just one of them in 1995. "Fine, just take them," Preston snapped. He took the wad of cash and shoved it into his pocket. I couldn't scream. I couldn't call the police. If I intervened now, they would know I was watching. They would find the cameras and cut the feed, and I would lose my eyes on the inside. I had to be smarter. I had to let the crime happen so I could solve it. I grabbed my phone and dialed a number. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. "Sarah, it is happening. They just sold the Reconstruction collection to a liquidator in a white van. License plate Georgia Bravo, Tango 49. He is heading south on Peachtree." Sarah was a friend from art school, a petite woman who looked harmless but negotiated like a shark. She was already positioned 3 blocks away in her truck waiting for my signal. We had anticipated this. We knew Preston needed money, and we knew he would liquidate the portable assets first. "I am on him," Amara Sarah said. "Do I have authorization to buy?" "Buy everything," I said. "Don't let him leave with a single scrap of canvas." I watched the screen as Preston walked back into the party looking relieved. He handed a few bills to the head caterer, and the music got louder. He thought he had solved his problem. He thought he was a genius. He had sold a fortune for pocket change, and he was celebrating his own stupidity. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed. It was a photo from Sarah. The back of her truck was filled with the portraits. They were safe. She had intercepted the van driver at a gas station and offered him $2,000 cash for the junk he had just bought. The driver, thinking he had just made a quadruple profit in 20 minutes, handed them over with a laugh. I stared at the photo on my phone screen. There was my great-grandfather's favorite painting safe in a blanket. I felt a strange mix of emotions swirling in my chest. There was the deep, aching grief of seeing my home disrespected, of watching strangers trample on my memories. But underneath that, there was a cold, hard satisfaction. Candace and Preston were digging their own graves. Every time they sold an asset, they were creating a paper trail of theft and mismanagement. Every time they destroyed property, they were violating the terms of the trust they hadn't bothered to read. They were handing me the evidence on a silver platter, and they were funding my legal battle with their own ignorance. I looked back at the monitors. Candace was now standing on a table holding a bottle of champagne, laughing hysterically. She looked like a queen. She had no idea she was already a pauper. "Enjoy the party, sister," I whispered to the screen. "Drink the expensive wine. Dance on the expensive floors. Because when the music stops, you won't even own the shoes on your feet." I saved the video clip of the transaction to 3 different hard drives. Then I leaned back in my chair and waited. The night was young, and I had a feeling they weren't done making mistakes, and I would be right here watching every single one of them. The notification light on my phone was pulsing red when I woke up on Tuesday morning. It wasn't the slow, rhythmic pulse of a single missed message. It was a frantic strobe light blinking that signaled a digital avalanche. I reached for the device, my fingers stiff with the morning ache of my condition, and swiped the screen. I expected to see a reply from a job application or perhaps a text from Mr. Whitaker. Instead, I saw my own face staring back at me from a stranger's Instagram story. The caption, written in bold, jagged font, read, "The ungrateful daughter exposed." My stomach dropped as I clicked the link. It led to a blog post on a popular local gossip site, the kind that housewives in Buckhead read over their morning mimosas to feel better about their own lives. The article was a masterpiece of fiction. It claimed that I had been leeching off my parents for years, draining their retirement accounts to fund a secret drug addiction, while my sister Candace tirelessly cared for them. It said I had been kicked out of the house not because of cruelty, but because I had stolen silver and jewelry from my dying mother. The comments section was a cesspool of judgment. People who didn't know me, people who had never stepped foot in my parents' house, were calling me a monster. They called me a parasite. They said I deserved to be homeless. I knew exactly where this came from. This had Preston's fingerprints all over it. He must have received the letter of representation from Mr. Whitaker yesterday. He realized I wasn't just going to disappear, so he panicked. He did what weak, frightened men always do. He tried to destroy my reputation so that no one would believe me when I finally told the truth. He was trying to win the court of public opinion because he knew he was going to lose in the court of law. I tried to put the phone down, but the vibration was constant. Anonymous numbers started texting me hateful messages. My LinkedIn profile was flooded with spam. The pressure in my chest began to build, a physical weight that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with my lupus. Stress is poison to a body like mine. It triggers the immune system to attack itself, and within hours, I could feel the familiar, terrifying heat rising in my joints. My skin felt like it was burning. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. By noon, I couldn't stand up. The motel room spun violently. I tried to reach for my water glass, but my hand wouldn't cooperate. The glass shattered on the floor, the sound exploding in my ears like a gunshot. I collapsed onto the carpet, my vision narrowing to a pinprick of light. The last thing I heard was the relentless buzzing of my phone, a digital chorus of hate cheering for my demise. I woke up to the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. The air was sterile and cold, smelling of antiseptic and floor wax. I blinked, trying to focus on the white ceiling tiles. I was in a hospital room. The pain in my joints had dulled to a throb masked by the IV drip in my arm. I turned my head and saw a silhouette sitting in the plastic chair by the window. It wasn't Candace. It wasn't Preston. It was Mr. Whitaker. He was reading a file, the light from the window catching the silver in his hair. When he saw I was awake, he closed the folder and leaned forward, his expression grave but kind. "You gave us quite a scare, Amara," he said softly. "The motel manager found you. You have been out for 24 hours. I tried to sit up, but he gestured for me to stay down. Rest," he commanded gently. "You are fighting a war on 2 fronts now, your body and your family. And you cannot win the second if you lose the first. Tears pricked my eyes. They are destroying me, Mr. Whitaker. You should see what they are saying online. They are saying I am an addict. They are saying I stole from Mom. How can I fight that? I need to post a statement. I need to show my medical records. No, Whitaker said. His voice was sharp, cutting through my panic. You will do no such thing. You will not post. You will not comment. You will not defend yourself. But silence looks like guilt, I argued, my voice cracking. Silence looks like guilt to fools, Whitaker corrected. To a judge, silence looks like dignity. And right now, we are not playing to the gallery, we are playing to the bench. He stood up and walked to the side of my bed. He looked down at me, and for the first time he let his professional mask slip. He looked angry. Not at me, but for me. Preston has made a fatal error, Whitaker whispered. By attacking your character publicly, he has opened a door he cannot close. He thinks he is discrediting you, but what he is actually doing is proving malice. He pulled a chair closer and lowered his voice as if the walls had ears. There is something I haven't told you yet, Amara. Something in the trust that your father insisted on. It is a rare provision called the Good Samaritan Clause. I frowned. I had never heard of it. Your father knew Candace was selfish, Whitaker explained. But he didn't know if she was cruel. He wanted to give her a chance. So the trust states that Candace inherits the bulk of the liquid assets only if she demonstrates a duty of care toward her family members, specifically you, for a period of 1 year after his death. If she acts with malice, if she causes harm, or if she abandons a family member in need, she forfeits her position as primary beneficiary. My heart skipped a beat. Forfeits everything. Whitaker confirmed. But here is the catch. We have to prove it wasn't just a sibling squabble. We have to prove systemic malicious intent to harm. And we have to prove that you did nothing to provoke it. That is why you must stay silent. If you get into a mudslinging fight on Facebook, Preston's lawyers will argue it was a mutual conflict. But if you remain the victim, if you remain silent while they throw stones, they are digging their own financial grave with every tweet and every interview. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a laptop. I brought this for you. While you are recovering, I don't want you reading comments. I want you working. We need to compile the evidence, not for Instagram, but for the exhibit list. I took the laptop. It felt heavy on my lap, but it was a good weight. It was the weight of a weapon. For the next 3 days, my hospital room became a war room. I didn't log into social media. I didn't answer texts. I let the world think I was broken. I let Preston think his smear campaign had worked. Meanwhile, I was digging into the digital trail they hadn't bothered to hide. I accessed the cloud backups from the house security system. I found the footage of Candace laughing as she threw my clothes into the mud. I found the audio of Preston calling me a useless burden. I organized them by date and time. Then Sarah sent me the video she had secretly recorded during the transaction with the van driver. It showed Preston selling 5 priceless paintings for $500 cash. It showed him pocketing the money without recording it. Mr. Whitaker forwarded me the forensic accounting files. We traced the transfers Preston was making. He was using the estate's credit cards to pay off high-interest loans in the Cayman Islands. He was bleeding the accounts dry, assuming he would replenish them once the house was sold. While Candace was posting photos of herself at charity galas, captioning them with quotes about resilience and healing, I was looking at the receipts of her fraud. She was playing a character on the internet. I was documenting a criminal in real life. The contrast was staggering. On one screen, I saw the lies. On the other, I saw the truth. And the silence Mr. Whitaker had imposed on me began to feel less like a cage and more like a shield. I realized that every lie they told was just another nail in their coffin. They were screaming for attention, desperate for validation. I was quiet, patient, and dangerous. On the morning of my discharge, I closed the laptop. I had a folder named Exhibit A through Z. I had bank statements, video clips, and the damning evidence of their cruelty. I looked at myself in the hospital bathroom mirror. I was pale and I had lost weight, but my eyes were clear. The fear was gone. I walked out of the hospital into the bright Atlanta sun. I didn't check my phone. I didn't care what the blogs were saying anymore. Let them talk. Let them spin their stories, because in 48 hours, we would be in a room where likes and shares didn't matter. We would be in a room where only the truth mattered, and I was bringing a storm they never saw coming. The 24 hours before the probate hearing felt less like a day and more like the slow intake of breath before a scream. While I was gathering my strength to leave the hospital, my sister Candace and her husband Preston were already popping champagne corks in the home that was no longer legally theirs. I knew this because Candace, incapable of silence, had posted a series of photos to her social media stories. They were captioned "New Chapter" and "Securing the Bag." In the photos, they were sitting on the patio I had swept 1,000 times, toasting to a victory they had not yet won. They looked relaxed. They looked rich. They looked like people who believed that the world worked a certain way, that the loud and the ruthless always ate first while the quiet and the sick starved in the dark. They had no idea that while they were drinking vintage Dom Perignon bought with stolen credit, I was walking out of the hospital doors with a briefcase full of evidence that would turn their champagne into vinegar. My discharge from the hospital was quiet. Mr. Whitaker had sent a car for me, but before it arrived I had to stop at the pharmacy counter near the exit to pick up a steroid prescription to manage the inflammation in my joints for the next day. The automatic doors slid open and the humid Atlanta air hit me thick with pollen and exhaust. I stepped onto the sidewalk, adjusting my grip on my bag when a shadow fell over me. I did not need to look up to know who it was. The smell of expensive cologne masking the scent of fear was unmistakable. "Hello, Amara." Preston was leaning against a black luxury SUV parked in the loading zone. He was wearing sunglasses, though the sky was overcast. He looked like a shark in a suit, sleek and predatory. He pushed off the car and took a step toward me, violating my personal space. I kept walking, my eyes fixed on the waiting sedan Mr. Whitaker had sent. "Don't walk away when I am talking to you," Preston said, his voice low and menacing. He reached out and grabbed my arm right above the elbow, where the IV bruise was still fresh. I stopped. I didn't pull away. I just looked at his hand, then up at his face. "Let go of me, Preston." He tightened his grip. "You are a stubborn girl, Amara. Stupid and stubborn. We offered you a way out. We offered you $10,000. Do you know how much rent that covers in the neighborhood you are going to end up in? A lot? I am not interested in your money," I said, my voice steady, despite the racing of my heart. "You should be," he hissed, leaning in closer so only I could hear. "Because if you walk into that courtroom tomorrow, you are walking into a slaughter. We have the will. We have the character witnesses. We have stories about your drug use that will make the judge vomit. You are going to lose, Amara, and when you lose, you will have nothing. No house, no insurance, no family. You will just be a sick, lonely woman dying in the street." He squeezed my arm harder, trying to make me flinch. "Don't show up," he whispered. "Do yourself a favor and disappear. Go visit an aunt in another state. Just vanish. If you step foot in that court, I will make sure the IRS audits every penny you have ever earned. I will make sure you never work in this town again." I looked into his eyes behind the dark lenses. I expected to feel fear. He was stronger than me. He was rich. He was powerful. But as I looked at him, I realized something that made me almost smile. He was sweating. A single bead of perspiration was trickling down his temple. His hand on my arm wasn't just aggressive, it was trembling. He wasn't threatening me because he was strong. He was threatening me because he was terrified. He knew that if I showed up, his house of cards would fall. I pulled my arm free with a sharp jerk. "You are sweating, Preston," I said quietly. "It is not that hot out here." He stepped back, surprised by my lack of fear. See you in court, I said. And then I got into the waiting sedan and locked the door. I watched him in the rearview mirror as we drove away. He stood there on the curb, a small, angry man, realizing that his intimidation tactics had just bounced off me like water off a stone. I went straight to Mr. Whitaker's office. We did not sleep that night. The conference room was buried under mountains of paper. We had the forensic accounting reports showing Preston's embezzlement. We had the security footage of Candace throwing my suitcase into the rain. We had the video of the illegal art sale. But the centerpiece of our strategy, the nuclear weapon we were saving for the very end, was the document Mr. Whitaker had pulled from his safe. The codicil, the amendment my father had signed 2 weeks before he died, specifically adding the Good Samaritan clause. Mr. Whitaker paced the room, rehearsing his opening statement. Amara, he said, pausing to look at me. The judge assigned to this case is Judge Sterling. She is fair, but she is strict. She hates drama. We cannot be emotional. We have to be surgical. When Preston lies, we do not gasp. We wait. We let him build his tower of lies as high as possible, and then we pull the bottom brick. I nodded, organizing the exhibits into binders. Exhibit A, the medical records proving I was capable of care. Exhibit B, the text messages from Preston. Exhibit C, the bill of sale for the warehouse. By 3 a.m, the work was done. The binders were stacked. The strategy was set. Mr. Whitaker told me to try to get a few hours of sleep on the leather sofa in his office, but I couldn't. My mind was racing. I wasn't afraid of the outcome anymore. I was afraid of who I had to become to win. I had to destroy my sister. I had to destroy the only family I had left. But then I remembered the rain. I remembered the way she laughed while I was in the mud. I realized that the sister I was mourning had died a long time ago. The woman in the mansion was just a stranger wearing her face. At 5 a.m, I went into the private bathroom attached to the office. I turned on the harsh fluorescent lights and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like a victim. My hair was long and stringy, lifeless from the months of stress and medication. My skin was pale, dark circles bruising the skin under my eyes. I looked like the sick, helpless girl Preston said I was. That girl could not win today. That girl belonged in the past. I found a pair of sharp, styling scissors in my travel bag. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a handful of my long, damaged hair and cut. The sound of the blades slicing through the strands was the most satisfying sound I had heard in weeks. Snip, snip, snip. Black locks fell into the white porcelain sink, carrying with them the weight of the last 5 years. I cut it into a sharp, angled bob that framed my jawline. I looked instantly older, tougher. I washed my face with cold water. I applied my makeup with the precision of a warrior painting on war paint, concealer to hide the fatigue, a bold crimson lipstick that signaled danger. Then I opened the garment bag I had brought with me. Inside was a suit my mother had worn to board meetings in the 90s. It was a vintage St. John knit, in a deep, regal navy blue with gold buttons. It was structured, powerful, and timeless. I slipped into the skirt and buttoned the jacket. It fit perfectly, as if she were hugging me from the grave. I looked in the mirror one last time. The sick girl was gone. The sister who begged for a place to sleep was gone. Staring back at me was the CEO of Phoenix Restoration. Staring back at me was the daughter of a king who had come to claim her crown. I walked out into the office. Mr. Whitaker was drinking coffee, reviewing a file. He looked up and stopped. He took off his glasses and stood up, a look of profound respect in his eyes. "You look like your mother," he said softly. "No," I corrected him, picking up the heavy briefcase containing the evidence that would end Preston's life as he knew it. "I look like the executor." "Let's go," I said. We walked out of the building and into the morning light. The sun was rising over Atlanta, burning off the mist. It was going to be a beautiful day for justice. The Fulton County Probate Court smelled of lemon, furniture polish, and old misery. It was a smell I knew well from books and movies, but experiencing it firsthand was suffocating. The air was thick with the weight of families tearing each other apart over money they did not earn. I sat on the hard wooden bench next to Mr. Whitaker, my hands folded perfectly in my lap to hide the slight tremor that still plagued my fingers. I was wearing my mother's vintage navy suit, the gold buttons cold against my skin. I had cut my hair, painted my lips crimson, and straightened my spine, but inside I was screaming. The double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a theatrical bang. It was not just an entrance. It was an arrival. Candace walked in like she was stepping onto a runway in Milan, rather than a legal proceeding in Atlanta. She was wearing a head-to-toe Gucci ensemble that screamed new money. The interlocking G logo was everywhere on her belt, on her bag, even stamped into the leather of her 6-inch heels. She wore a black veil that was so sheer it was purely decorative, designed to highlight her professionally applied makeup rather than hide her grief. Beside her, Preston walked with the swagger of a man who had already spent the money in his head. He was flanked by 3 attorneys in matching charcoal suits, a phalanx of corporate sharks he had undoubtedly hired on credit. They did not look at me. They looked through me. To them, I was just an obstacle, a piece of furniture that had been inconveniently placed in their path to the bank. They sat at the plaintiff's table, arranging their expensive leather binders and whispering confidently to one another. I saw Preston smirk as he glanced at Mr. Whitaker. He probably thought it was pathetic that I had hired my father's old semi-retired lawyer while he had a team from a top downtown firm. He did not know that Mr. Whitaker had more law in his little finger than Preston's entire team had in their collective hard drives. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Patterson entered. She was a formidable woman with steel gray hair pulled back into a severe bun and eyes that looked like they could detect a lie from 50 paces. She sat down, adjusted her robes, and looked over her spectacles at the 2 tables. "We are here for the probate hearing of the estate of Franklin and Odessa Washington," she said, her voice dry and authoritative. "Let us proceed." Preston's lead attorney stood up. He was a young, aggressive man named Mr. Vance, who spoke with the rapid-fire cadence of a salesperson. "Your Honor," he began, buttoning his jacket. "This case is simple. We have a valid last will and testament dated 5 years ago. It names my client, Candace Washington Smith, as the primary executor and sole beneficiary of the estate. We also have ample evidence to suggest that the other sibling, Ms. Amara Washington, is unfit to manage any portion of this inheritance due to chronic health issues and a history of financial instability." I felt the blood drain from my face. Unfit. Financial instability. They were not just trying to take the money, they were trying to erase my personhood. Mr. Vance continued pacing in front of the bench. "Ms. Amara suffers from severe lupus, a condition that, while unfortunate, has rendered her dependent on her parents for years. She has no steady employment. She has no assets. Placing a multi-million-dollar estate in her hands would be negligent. Her parents knew this. That is why they left everything to Candace. They wanted Candace to be the guardian, the steward. They knew Amara needed to be taken care of, not burdened with responsibility. It was a brilliant, twisted narrative. They were painting their greed as charity. They were stealing my birthright and calling it protection. I dug my fingernails into my palms to keep from standing up and shouting. Mr. Whitaker placed a calming hand on my arm. He did not say a word, but his grip was firm. His touch seemed to say, "Let them talk." Mr. Vance called his first witness. Candace. My sister walked to the stand, pausing to dab at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. She sat down, looked at the judge, and began the performance of her life. "It has been so hard, Your Honor," Candace said, her voice trembling just the right amount. "Taking care of Mom and Dad at the end. It was exhausting. I was there every day. I cooked their meals, I managed their medications. I sacrificed my own career to be their rock." I stared at her, my mouth going dry. Candace had been to the house exactly 3 times in the last 6 months of their lives. Once to borrow money, once to show off a new car, and once to complain that Dad wasn't lucid enough to sign a check. I was the one who slept in the chair next to the hospital bed. I was the one who learned how to administer morphine. I was the one who held Mom's hand when she took her last breath. And Amara Candace continued looking sadly in my direction. I love my sister, I really do. But she made it so difficult. She would disappear for days. She was always asking them for money. I think she was jealous of the bond I had with them. Mom told me right before she passed that she was worried Amara would squander everything on her lifestyle. What lifestyle? I wanted to scream. My lifestyle of buying generic ibuprofen and eating ramen noodles so I could afford the heating bill. The judge nodded slowly, taking notes. I saw the look on her face. It was sympathy. She saw a polished, successful woman grieving her parents and trying to deal with a troubled, sick sister. The narrative was working. On paper, Candace looked like the responsible citizen, and I looked like the liability. Preston leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs. He caught my eye and winked. It was a tiny, imperceptible movement, but it hit me like a slap. He thought he had already won. He thought the courtroom was just a formality. Mr. Vance concluded his questioning. The estate is substantial, Your Honor. $30 million in assets, including the family home and various investments. My client Candace simply wants to honor her parents' wishes. She wants to secure the legacy. She has already begun the hard work of organizing the property, cleaning out the hoard of junk her father left behind, and modernizing the investments. Cleaning out the hoard. That is what they called my father's life work. That is what they called the history I had saved from the dumpster. Judge Patterson looked over at our table. Mr. Whitaker, do you have any cross-examination or opening statements? Mr. Whitaker stood up slowly. He did not button his jacket. He did not pace. He just stood there, leaning slightly on the table, looking like a grandfather who was disappointed in his grandchildren. We do, Your Honor, Mr. Whitaker said, his voice deep and gravelly. But not yet. We would like to reserve our time until the plaintiff has fully rested their case. We want the record to be complete. The judge frowned slightly but nodded. Very well. Mr. Vance, do you have any further witnesses? We do not. Your Honor, Vance said, looking smug. The will speaks for itself. The medical records speak for themselves. We ask for a summary judgment to confirm the validity of the 2018 will and grant full executorship to Candace Washington Smith. The courtroom went silent. The air conditioner hummed a low drone that sounded like a countdown. This was the moment. They had laid out their entire lie. They had put it on the public record under oath. They had perjured themselves a dozen times in the last hour. Judge Patterson looked at me. Ms. Washington, you have been very quiet. Your sister has made some serious claims about your capacity and your conduct. Do you have nothing to say? I looked at the judge. Then I looked at Candace, who was checking her reflection in the back of a spoon on the table. Then I looked at Preston, who was checking his watch, probably calculating how long until he could transfer the funds to his Cayman account. I stood up. My legs did not shake. My heart was pounding, but it was a war drum, not a panic attack. I picked up the heavy black briefcase sitting at my feet. I placed it on the table with a solid thud that echoed through the room. I reached inside and pulled out a single silver USB drive. I held it tightly in my hand. It was cold and small, but it contained the weight of the world. We have a lot to say, Your Honor, I said, my voice clear and ringing off the mahogany walls, but we prefer to show it. And I believe once you see what is on this drive, the question won't be about my capacity. It will be about their liberty. Candace stopped checking her reflection. Preston stopped checking his watch. For the first time since they walked in, the arrogance in the room began to crack. The air pressure shifted. The storm had arrived. The silence in the courtroom following my statement was absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes a natural disaster, the moment when the birds stop singing because they know the hurricane is making landfall. I sat back down, my heart hammering a rhythm against my ribs, and looked at Mr. Whitaker. He gave me a barely perceptible nod, adjusted his glasses, and stood up. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an old lion, who knows he does not need to roar to be dangerous. He walked to the center of the room, holding a simple manila folder in his hand. It looked insignificant compared to the stack of leather-bound binders on the plaintiff's table, but I knew that inside that folder lay the ruin of my sister's arrogance. Mr. Whitaker placed the folder on the podium and looked up at Judge Patterson. Your Honor, we do not dispute the existence of the 2018 will presented by the plaintiff. It was indeed signed by Franklin and Odessa Washington 5 years ago. However, the law recognizes that life is not static. Relationships change, circumstances change, and people change. The plaintiff would have this court believe that my client's parents remained frozen in time, blind to the reality of their family dynamic. But they were not blind. They were watching. He opened the folder and pulled out a document stamped with a blue notary seal. 2 weeks before his passing, Franklin Washington summoned me to his bedside. He was weak in body, but his mind was as sharp as a razor. He, along with his wife Odessa, executed a codicil, an amendment to their last will and testament. This document, which I am submitting into evidence as Defense Exhibit A, supersedes the distribution clauses of the previous will. Mr. Vance Preston's attorney shot up from his chair like he had been electrocuted. Objection, Your Honor. We have never seen this document. We question its authenticity. Mr. Washington was heavily medicated in his final weeks. We argue lack of testamentary capacity. He could not have understood what he was signing. Mr. Whitaker did not flinch. He expected this. He turned to the bailiff. We anticipated this objection. That is why we recorded the signing. With the court's permission, I would like to play Defense Exhibit B. Judge Patterson nodded. Proceed. The lights in the courtroom dimmed. A large screen descended from the ceiling. I held my breath as the projector hummed to life. Suddenly, there they were, my mother and father. They were sitting up in their hospital bed in the living room. Dad looked frail, his skin papery and thin, but his eyes were bright. Mom was holding his hand. A younger associate from Mr. Whitaker's firm was holding a newspaper with that day's date clearly visible. On the screen, the lawyer asked Franklin Odessa, "Do you understand what you are signing today?" My father looked directly into the camera lens. It felt like he was looking right at me across the barrier of death. Yes, Dad's voice rasped, amplified by the courtroom speakers. We are updating our will because we have realized that blood does not make a family. Care makes a family. We are adding specific conditions to the inheritance to ensure that the wealth we built protects the child who protected us. Mom squeezed his hand and added, "We are of sound mind. We are heartbroken, but we are lucid. This is our final wish." The screen went black. The lights came back on. I looked over at the plaintiff's table. Candace's face was the color of ash. Her mouth was slightly open, her perfect lipstick suddenly looking like a clown's makeup. She had told the court she was there every day. The video proved that in their final, most critical legal moment, she was nowhere to be found. She hadn't even known the meeting took place. Mr. Whitaker continued, his voice hardening. As you can see, your honor capacity is not an issue. But motive is. The opposing counsel painted a picture of a loving sister simply trying to manage an estate. But we believe the motivation here is not stewardship, it is desperation. He turned his body, angling himself toward Preston. I would like to direct the court's attention to the Forensic Accounting Report, Defense Exhibit C. Mr. Whitaker walked toward Preston, who was now sweating profusely. He had loosened his tie and his confident sprawl had replaced by a rigid defensive posture. Mr. Smith Whitaker said, addressing Preston directly, "You are a real estate developer, correct? And you consider yourself a savvy investor." Mr. Vance stood up. Objection. Relevance. My client's profession is not on trial. It goes to the fitness of the executor. Whitaker countered smoothly. If the proposed executor cannot manage his own finances, how can he be trusted with a $30 million estate? The judge waved her hand. Overruled. I will allow it. Whitaker smiled. Mr. Smith, according to these bank records in the last 6 months, you transferred $400,000 from your joint savings account to a crypto exchange based in the Bahamas. Is that correct? Preston shifted in his seat. That was a diversification strategy. And is it true, Whitaker pressed, that this strategy resulted in a 90% loss of value within 48 hours? Is it also true that you currently have 3 active liens against your own personal residence for unpaid contractor fees? Preston didn't answer. He looked at Candace. Candace looked at him, her eyes widening in horror. She evidently didn't know about the liens. She didn't know they were broke. The illusion of their perfect power couple life was shattering in real time, right there in the courtroom. Whitaker didn't let up. You are drowning in debt, Mr. Smith. And you saw this estate not as a legacy to preserve, but as a lifeline to grab. You needed liquid cash immediately. That is why you tried to force Amara to sign a settlement for pennies. That is why you sold 5 heirloom paintings out of the back door of the mansion during a party last Saturday. Candace gasped. You sold the paintings! You told me you put them in storage. Order Judge Patterson banged her gavel. Ms. Washington Smith, control yourself. Whitaker walked back to the podium. He had stripped them naked. He had proven they were liars and failures, but he wasn't done. He had to prove they were cruel. The codicil had a specific trigger and we needed to pull it. Your Honor, Whitaker said, his voice dropping to a somber register. The codicil contains a provision my client's father called the Good Samaritan Clause. It states that the inheritance is conditional. It is conditional on the humane treatment of Amara Washington. The parents knew Amara was vulnerable due to her illness. They stipulated that if the primary beneficiary, Candace, acted with malice, cruelty, or abandoned her sister in a time of need, the entire estate would bypass her. Mr. Vance scoffed. That is subjective. You cannot prove malice. My client evicted her sister because the house was being renovated. That is a business decision, not cruelty. Whitaker looked at me. I nodded. It was time. We disagree, Whitaker said. And again, we do not ask the court to take our word for it. We ask the court to believe its own eyes. He held up a second USB drive. On the night of the funeral, a security camera on the front porch of the Washington estate recorded the interaction between the sisters. The plaintiff claims she politely asked Amara to leave. This video shows a different reality. Preston jumped up, knocking his chair over. Objection. That is private property. You cannot use surveillance footage without consent. It is estate property, Whitaker shot back. And as a potential beneficiary, Amara has the right to access the security logs. Judge Patterson peered over her glasses at Preston. Mr. Smith, sit down. If you have nothing to hide, the video shouldn't worry you. She turned to the bailiff. Play the footage. Preston sank back into his chair, his face pale. He looked like a man who was watching a guillotine blade slowly rise above his neck. He whispered something to Candace, grabbing her wrist. She yanked her hand away, staring at the screen with a mixture of terror and confusion. I watched the screen as the timestamp appeared. It was the night of the storm, the night I lost everything. But as the video began to play, I realized that night wasn't the end. It was the evidence. The hunter had become the hunted, and the trap they had set for me was about to snap shut on their own necks. The courtroom darkened again, and the grainy image of the front porch flickered to life. The lights in the courtroom dimmed, until the only illumination came from the glowing rectangle of the projection screen descending from the ceiling. I sat in the semi-darkness, feeling the cold wood of the bench against my back, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Beside me, Mr. Whitaker adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, his silhouette sharp against the projection. Across the aisle, I could hear the shallow, rapid breathing of my sister Candace. She knew what was coming. She knew that the curated image of the grieving, devoted daughter she had spent weeks building was about to be dismantled frame by frame. The video began to play. It was grainy black and white footage from the security camera mounted above the main entrance of our family estate. The timestamp in the corner read 10:30 p.m. on the night of the funeral. The audio crackled to life, filling the silent courtroom with the sound of heavy rain hitting the pavement. Then came the voices. On the screen, the heavy oak doors swung open. Preston appeared first, dragging my battered suitcase. He looked nothing like the polished businessman sitting at the plaintiff's table today. On screen, he was disheveled, his face twisted in a sneer. He hauled the suitcase to the edge of the porch and with a violent heave threw it down the stairs. The sound of the luggage hitting the wet concrete was a dull, heavy thud that made several jurors flinch. Then came Candace. She stepped out into the storm still wearing her funeral dress. She pointed a finger at the figure standing in the rain, which was me. The courtroom speakers amplified her voice, stripping away any possibility of denial. "Find somewhere else to die." Amara, the digital version of Candace, screamed. "You are useless now. The free ride is over." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The jurors looked from the screen to the woman sitting at the plaintiff's table. Candace was staring at her lap, her face hidden behind her hair. But the video was not done. On screen, Preston stepped up beside his wife. He put his arm around her, but not in comfort. He laughed. It was a cruel, hollow sound. "Let her go," Preston said, his voice dripping with malice. "The old man is dead, and the old woman is gone. They can't protect their little pet anymore. This is our kingdom now." The video froze on that frame. The image of them standing on the porch, safe and dry, while I stood in the mud, was burned into the retina of every person in the room. The lights flickered back on. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was heavy with judgment. Judge Patterson stared at the frozen image for a long moment, before slowly turning her gaze to Preston. Her expression was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. Mr. Whitaker stood up. He did not look triumphant. He looked solemn. He walked to the podium carrying the codicil, the amendment to the will that my parents had signed in secret. "Your Honor." He began, his voice deep and resonant. "My clients, Franklin and Odessa Washington, were generous people. But they were not fools. They knew that money changes people. They knew that greed can rot a family from the inside out. And they feared deeply what might happen to their youngest daughter Amara once they were gone." He opened the document to a specific page. "I direct the court's attention to page 42, clause 7, subsection B. My clients referred to this as the Good Samaritan clause." Preston's attorney stood up, his voice shaking slightly. "Objection. This is highly irregular." "Sit down, Mr. Vance," Judge Patterson snapped, not even looking at him. "Read the clause, Mr. Whitaker." Whitaker lifted the paper and began to read. "I, Franklin Washington, being of sound mind, do hereby stipulate that the inheritance of the primary beneficiary, Candace Washington Smith, is conditional. It is contingent upon her demonstrating a duty of care, kindness, and family unity toward her sister Amara Washington for a period of 1 year following our death." Whitaker paused, letting the words sink in. He looked directly at Candace. The clause continues. "If at any point the primary beneficiary acts with malice, cruelty, or forcibly removes Amara Washington from the family home without just cause, or if she fails to provide for her sister's medical well-being, then the conditional inheritance is immediately revoked." "Revoked," Preston whispered, his face draining of color. Whitaker raised his voice for the final sentence. "In the event of such revocation triggered by verifiable evidence of malice, the entirety of the estate, including all real property, liquid assets, and investments, shall bypass the primary beneficiary completely. 100% of the estate shall be transferred immediately and irrevocably to the sole remaining beneficiary, Amara Washington, who has demonstrated the true values of this family." The words hung in the air like the tolling of a bell. 100%. Preston stood up so fast his chair flew backward and crashed onto the floor. "No," he screamed, his voice cracking. "That is a lie. That is a fake document. It is a trap. They set us up. Mr. Whitaker calmly closed the folder. The video we just watched, Mr. Smith, was the trigger. By throwing your sister-in-law out into the rain, by denying her access to her home and her medication, and by mocking the memory of the deceased, you pulled the trigger yourself. You didn't just evict Amara. You evicted yourselves from the will. Beside him, Candace made a sound like a wounded animal. She looked at Preston, then at me, and finally at the judge. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The Gucci dress, the remodeling plans, the high society dreams, it was all gone. It turned to ash in her mouth. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she slumped sideways, sliding off her chair in a dead faint. Candace Preston yelled, but he didn't reach down to help her. He looked at the judge, panic wild in his eyes. Your Honor, she is sick. She didn't mean it. We can explain. Judge Patterson banged her gavel. The sound was sharp and final. There is nothing to explain, Mr. Smith, the judge said, her voice like steel. The evidence is incontrovertible. The video speaks for itself, and the will speaks for itself. The Good Samaritan clause has been activated by your own hands. She looked down at her paperwork and signed a document with a flourish. I am hereby ruling in favor of the defense. The conditional inheritance of Candace Washington Smith is declared void due to violation of the moral clause. The entire estate is awarded to Amara Washington, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am ordering a forensic audit of Mr. Smith's finances regarding the missing assets mentioned earlier. Bailiff, please assist Mrs. Smith. Next case. Pandemonium erupted. Reporters in the back row were already typing on their phones. The bailiff moved toward Preston, who was still shouting that it was a conspiracy. Candace was groaning on the floor, her expensive veil tangled around her face. I sat perfectly still. I felt Mr. Whitaker's hand on my shoulder. We did it, Amara, he whispered. I looked across the aisle at the chaos. I looked at the sister who had told me to die, now lying helpless on the floor. I looked at the brother-in-law who had called me useless, now facing a criminal investigation. I didn't feel joy. I felt a deep, profound sense of balance. The scales had tipped, the rain had stopped, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one left out in the cold. I stood up, smoothed the skirt of my mother's navy suit, and prepared to walk out of that courtroom not as a victim, but as the owner of my own destiny. The chaos in the lobby of the Fulton County Courthouse was a physical force. Reporters swarmed like sharks, smelling blood in the water, their microphones thrust forward to catch the first words of the fallen socialites. I stood near the back, flanked by Mr. Whitaker and the court marshals, watching the scene unfold with a strange sense of detachment. It felt like watching a nature documentary where the predators turn on each other when the prey escapes. Preston pushed through the heavy double doors first, his face a mask of purple rage. He was walking so fast, he nearly tripped over a cameraman. Candace stumbled after him, her veil-torn mascara running down her cheeks in jagged black lines. She reached out, grabbing the sleeve of his expensive suit jacket, desperate for an anchor in the storm that had just swallowed her life. "Preston, wait!" she sobbed, her voice high and thin. "We can appeal. We can fix this. Don't leave me!" Preston spun around. He did not look like a husband. He looked like a cornered animal. The veneer of the charming real estate developer had completely dissolved, leaving only the raw, ugly greed beneath. He looked at Candace, the woman he had conspired with, the woman whose hand he had held while they threw me into the rain, and he did not see a partner. He saw a liability. "Fix this!" Preston screamed, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "You stupid, useless woman! You told me the sister was weak. You told me she would roll over. You cost me everything." And then, in front of 50 witnesses and a dozen rolling cameras, he raised his hand. The sound of his palm striking her cheek was sharp and sickening, cutting through the noise of the press pack. Candace reeled back, clutching her face, her eyes wide with shock. It wasn't the pain that stunned her. It was the sudden, brutal realization that the love she thought she had bought with our parents' money was as fake as the smile she wore on Instagram. "I am done," Preston spat, adjusting his cuffs as if he had just touched something filthy. I am filing for divorce this afternoon. You are broke, Candace. And I don't do broke. He turned to storm toward the exit, pushing a reporter out of his way. He thought he could just walk out. He thought he could divorce his way out of the debt and the fraud. But he had forgotten one thing. I had given Mr. Whitaker the forensic accounting files 3 days ago, and Mr. Whitaker had given them to the district attorney. As Preston reached the revolving doors, 4 men in windbreakers stepped out to block his path. They didn't look like lawyers. They looked like the end of the line. One of them flashed a badge. Preston Smith, the detective, said, his voice calm and bored. "We have a warrant for your arrest regarding tax evasion, wire fraud, and embezzlement of estate funds. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Preston froze. For a second, he looked like he might run. He looked left, then right, but there was nowhere to go. The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding strobe, capturing the moment the golden boy realized he was going to prison. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he looked over the shoulder of the officer. His eyes found mine across the crowded lobby. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked small. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I just watched. Candace stood alone in the center of the circle, holding her bruising cheek. She watched her husband, the man she had betrayed her family for, being shoved into the back of a police cruiser. She looked around for a friendly face for one of the high society friends she had invited to the party last week. But the crowd was thinning. The people who had drunk her champagne were now averting their eyes, checking their phones, distancing themselves from the scandal. She was radioactive. I turned to Mr. Whitaker. "Let's go home," I said. The drive back to Buckhead was quiet. When we pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the estate, there was a locksmith van already parked in the driveway. The court order had been immediate. Mr. Whitaker had arranged for the locks to be changed within the hour of the verdict. I stepped out of the car. The house loomed large against the afternoon sky. For the last 5 years, this building had been a prison of memories and a battleground. But today, the air felt different. The tension that had gripped the property, the feeling of walking on eggshells, was gone. I walked up the front steps. I stopped at the exact spot where Preston had thrown my suitcase. I looked down at the concrete. It was dry now. I took the new key the locksmith handed me. It was heavy, solid brass. I slid it into the lock. It turned with a smooth, satisfying click. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was quiet. Not the silence of a tomb, but the silence of a deep breath after a long run. The house smelled of the cheap cleaning products Candace preferred, and the lingering scent of her perfume. But underneath that, I could smell the old wood, the beeswax, the history waiting to be exhaled. I walked into the living room. It was a mess. There were wine stains on the rug from their premature victory party. There were outline marks on the walls where the paintings used to hang before I saved them. The modern furniture Candace had ordered was garish and out of place, clashing violently with the architecture. But I didn't feel angry. I felt a profound sense of peace. The cancer had been cut out. The healing could begin. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from the security system. Someone was at the gate. I checked the camera feed on my phone. It was Candace. She was standing outside the closed iron gates, still in her funeral dress, holding her broken heel in one hand. She was punching the code into the keypad over and over again. But the code had been changed. I watched her for a moment. She looked small and pathetic. She tried to call Preston, but his phone was undoubtedly in an evidence bag. She tried to call her friends. I watched her make call after call, her frustration turning to panic as each one went to voicemail. Her credit cards were frozen. Her husband was in jail. Her home was locked. She was experiencing exactly what she had inflicted on me, but without the innocence to comfort her. She looked up at the camera knowing I was watching. She didn't scream this time. She just slumped against the iron bars and slid down to the ground, putting her head in her hands. I turned off the screen. I didn't need to watch anymore. Her punishment wasn't my job. Her punishment was her life. I walked to the center of the room and took a deep breath. I picked up my phone and dialed a number. "Hello, is this Miller Restoration?" I asked. "Yes, this is David." "Hi, David. This is Amara Washington. I have a project, a big one. I need to undo some modern renovations and restore a historic property to its original condition. I need a team that knows how to work with 19th century mahogany and silk wallpaper. When can you start?" "Monday is fine," I said, smiling as I ran my hand along the banister. I hung up and walked to the window. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the lawn. I wasn't just the owner of a $30 million estate, I was the custodian of a legacy. I thought about my father's notebook safe in my bag. I thought about the warehouse full of treasures waiting to be brought home. I went to the kitchen and filled a kettle with water. I found a chipped mug that used to be my father's one that Candace had deemed too ugly to use but hadn't bothered to throw away yet. I made a cup of tea. I sat on the back porch watching the fireflies begin to dance in the twilight. For the first time in years, my joints didn't hurt. The stress that had been eating me alive was gone. I took a sip of tea. It tasted like freedom. I wasn't celebrating the destruction of my sister. I was celebrating the survival of myself. The house was bruised just like me. But we were both still standing. And tomorrow, the real work of rebuilding would begin. The magnolia trees lining the driveway of the Washington estate were in full bloom, their massive white flowers perfuming the air with a scent that finally overpowered the lingering memories of the past. It had been 6 months since the gavel fell in Judge Patterson's courtroom, 6 months since the storm broke and the sun finally came out. I stood on the balcony of what used to be my parents' bedroom holding a cup of herbal tea. My hands were steady. The inflammation that had plagued my joints for years had receded, calmed by a combination of proper medication, rest, and the most effective medicine of all, which was peace. The house behind me was no longer a mausoleum of silence. It was alive. Downstairs in the main salon, a group of young artists from the inner city were setting up easels for their afternoon class. In the library, a support group for women with autoimmune diseases was sharing their stories, their laughter drifting up through the open windows. I had renamed the estate the Phoenix Center. It was a foundation dedicated to preserving African American art and providing holistic support for those fighting chronic illnesses. The money Preston had tried to steal was now funding scholarships and chemotherapy treatments. The house that Candace had tried to turn into a monument to her own vanity had become a sanctuary for the community. I walked back inside and looked at the wall where the stolen portraits used to hang. They were back now, restored and framed, watching over the bustle of activity with dignified approval. My father would have loved this. He never wanted a museum. He wanted a legacy. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was the security guard at the front gate. "Ms. Washington, there is a woman here to see you. She says she is your sister. She says it is an emergency." I felt a flicker of the old anxiety, a phantom pain in my chest, but I breathed through it. "Send her to the service entrance," I said calmly. I walked down the back stairs, bypassing the grand foyer. I didn't want to disrupt the art class. I opened the heavy steel door of the service entrance, the same door Preston had used to sell my father's paintings for pennies. Candace was standing there. If I hadn't known it was her, I might not have recognized the woman shivering in the warm afternoon sun. The Gucci armor was gone. She was wearing a faded denim jacket over a polyester dress that looked 2 sizes too big. Her hair, once a blonde helmet of perfection, was dark at the roots and pulled back into a messy bun. Her face was gaunt, the skin dull and gray. She looked 20 years older than the woman who had stood on the porch 6 months ago. She didn't look me in the eye. She looked at her shoes, which were scuffed sneakers. "Amara," she whispered, her voice raspy. "Hello, Candace," I said. I didn't step aside to let her in. I stood in the doorway, a guardian of the peace I had built. "I need help," she said, finally looking up. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "Preston took everything. The lawyers took the rest. I have been sleeping on a friend's couch, but she kicked me out this morning. I have nowhere to go." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was an eviction notice from a cheap apartment complex. I just need $500, she begged, tears spilling over. Just for a deposit on a room. Please, Amara. I know I was awful. I know I messed up. But we are sisters. Mom and Dad wouldn't want me on the street. $500. The number hung in the air between us, heavy with irony. It was the exact amount she had shoved into my hand the night she kicked me out. It was the price she had put on my dignity. I looked at her, really looked at her. I searched for anger inside myself, but I found none. I just felt a distant, cool pity. I don't have $500 for you, Candace, I said softly. Her face crumpled. Please. You have millions. You have the whole estate. I do, I agreed. But I don't give handouts. I give opportunities. Dad taught us that money without labor has no value. You never learned that lesson. You thought you deserved the world just because you existed. I stepped back into the mudroom and picked up a folded pile of fabric from the bench. I held it out to her. It was a gray uniform. A janitor's uniform. We are hiring, I said. The Phoenix Center needs a groundskeeper. Someone to sweep the courtyard, clean the brushes for the art students, and scrub the floors. The pay is $15 an hour. It is honest work. Candace stared at the uniform as if it were infected. You want me to be a maid? She gasped. In my own house. It is not your house, I corrected her gently. It hasn't been your house for a long time, and it is not a maid. It is a staff member. You can start today. There is a broom in the closet. If you work a full shift, you will have enough for a motel room by tonight. She looked at me with a flash of her old indignation. I can't do that. What will people think? I leaned against the doorframe. People aren't thinking about you, Candace. That is the freedom of hitting rock bottom. No one is watching. The only person you have to impress is yourself. I placed the uniform in her shaking hands. Take it or leave it. But this is the only mercy I have for you. She stood there for a long time, trembling. She looked at the heavy brass knocker on the door, then at the manicured gardens behind me. She looked at the uniform. Slowly, painfully, the fight went out of her. She realized she had no cards left to play. She was no longer the golden child. She was just a woman who needed to eat. She nodded a single jerky movement. Where is the broom? She whispered. I pointed to the utility closet. 10 minutes later, I stood at the window of my father's study. Down below in the courtyard, Candace was sweeping. She moved awkwardly, her rhythm stiff, but she was working. She was sweeping away the fallen magnolia leaves, cleaning the path for the people inside, who were busy healing. I watched her for a moment, the image searing itself into my memory. The roles had reversed completely, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. She was finally learning the value of work. She was finally contributing. It was the kindest thing I could have done for her. I reached out and closed the window, latching it firmly. The sound of the broom on the pavement faded away, replaced by the soft jazz music playing in the room. I walked over to my desk, opened the leather notebook, and turned to a fresh blank page. Family is not defined by the blood that runs through your veins. It is defined by the way we treat each other when we think no one is looking. It is defined by who holds the umbrella when it rains and who throws you into the storm. I learned that the hard way, but I learned it for good. I didn't lose a sister. I lost an illusion. And in the space that illusion left behind, I found myself. If you are watching this and you feel like the black sheep or the outcast or the one who was left behind, listen to me. Your value is not determined by how they treat you. It is determined by what you build from the rocks they throw at you. Don't wait for an apology that may never come. Take the pen, turn the page, and write your own ending. My name is Amara Washington, and this is my legacy. Thank you for listening to my story. If you believe that justice is real and that it is never too late to reclaim your power, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the rain doesn't last forever. And let me know in the comments, what is the one thing you have built that you are most proud of? I will be reading every single one. Until next time, keep fighting.